seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones, and it's murdering our children. Let there be no mistake. This stuff is poison.
If the mass media would get a hold of it and do something about it, but they're covering it up. And that is you were talking about the government involvement in drugs. There have been government investigations, there have been private investigations, and we've interviewed a lot of people, ex-CIA people, who have talked about the CIA involvement in drug operations for many decades.
I think he's on to something, and I think we've gotten some other information too, of course, that the CIA has given Noriega over the years $200,000 a year.
Oh, yes.
And they kept feeding him money, even when Bush was the head of the CIA. I think George Bush is deep into it, well over his head. Somebody asked me once if I thought George Bush knew about as much what's going on as Ronald Reagan. I think George Bush knew a lot more about what was happening in the CIA, because I think Reagan was probably more removed from it, I mean, just by his own personality and maybe his age or something. But I think George Bush, through his office and through the fact that he was a member of this, head of the CIA, I think he was very, very close to it. He knows exactly what was happening, and I believe the rule that once a CIA member, always a CIA member. And I think it's awful interesting. Can you imagine? It would alarm a few of us in this country if all of a sudden we knew that the leader in the Soviet Union would be the head KGB agent, and here we take our head CIA agent and put him, potentially the head of our entire country. Unfortunately, I wish that we could get this information out, and I continue to talk about it, but I sadly believe that there will be very little said, which means that the Democrat aren't doing it, that means they're involved too.
It was one of America's most notorious presidential scandals that almost cost Ronald Reagan his presidency. The Iran-Contra affair. In the early 1980s, the U.S. was still in a Cold War with Russia, and anti-communist sentiment was strong. During his presidential campaign, Reagan promised to assist anti-communist insurgencies around the world. For a brief time under Reagan, the CIA trained and assisted groups fighting communist leaders abroad. Reagan was particularly interested in a group called the Contras and their battle in Nicaragua. The Contras were a group battling the Cuban-backed Sandinistas, a communist group who had seized power in 1979. Reagan called the Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. But much of the Contras' funding came from the cocaine trade. Because of this, Congress passed the Bolin Amendment, specifically aimed at keeping American money from funding the group. That happened in 1982, shortly after Reagan took office. The amendment restricted the CIA and Department of Defense from using funds to provide military assistance to groups that were trying to overthrow Nicaragua's government, groups like the Contras. This didn't stop Reagan. The president told his national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, to help the Contras anyway, regardless of the cost. McFarlane found opportunity in Iran. In 1985, an Iranian-backed terrorist group held 7 American hostages in Lebanon. Reagan insisted his advisors find a way to bring the hostages home, saying, "I want you to do whatever you have to do to help these people keep body and soul together." So with permission from Reagan, McFarlane made a deal. The U.S. would give Iran weapons, and Iran would broker the release of the hostages. This happened even though Reagan publicly insisted he would not negotiate with terrorists, and despite the fact that there was a trade embargo with Iran. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The deal with Iran didn't just secretly secure the release of the hostages in exchange for weapons. There was money involved. While $30 million had been allocated for the weapons, the CIA funneled a portion of that money to the Contras in Nicaragua, the group Reagan supported in their guerrilla fight against the Sandinista government. In 1986, the Lebanese newspaper Al-Shura reported the arms deal, and everything began to unravel. That prompted an investigation by the U.S. Attorney General, who discovered that only $12 million of the $30 million actually went toward weapons for Iran. The rest of the money was sent to the Contras in Nicaragua. The revelations were explosive. Reagan denied the allegations that he had negotiated with terrorists, but Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North came forward and acknowledged that he diverted funds to the Contras. North also said Reagan knew about it. North's testimony would inspire the press and Congress to launch investigations against Reagan for the rest of his presidency. Texas Senator John Tower led the investigation into the scandal. The Tower Commission determined it was Reagan's lack of oversight that allowed Iran-Contra to happen, but did not implicate Reagan directly. It wasn't until another congressional investigation in 1987 that Reagan finally testified. On May 5, 1987, joint hearings were televised investigating the covert arms deal with Iran and the assistance to Nicaragua. The hearings would go on for 41 days. Reagan was never charged, but McFarland, Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter, were all found guilty. Yet, speculation about Reagan's involvement lingered on. Press investigations would go on for years to follow. While Reagan's image suffered a bit, he still left office with one of the highest approval ratings of any president in U.S. history.
What role did the U.S. government play in bringing crack cocaine into LA's poor black neighborhoods?
The government needed this money to fight this war over in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas. Russia had gave the Sandinistas $100 million to fight with. Congress had cut off all the money from the Contras. So now the Sandinistas had an advantage. Reagan and Bush had made the Contras their pet peeve. They felt that if Russia took over Nicaragua, they would be too close to America. They would be in our backyard. I believe that they felt it was more valuable to sacrifice a particular sector of America and a race of people in America in order to save the whole country. So they let these guys open up pipelines. Danilo Blandon, Norman Nessis, and the rest of the crew that worked with the Nicaraguan connection. Because I knew about 10 or 15 different Nicaraguans that was all inside of this, Contra organization that was selling drugs. So by them allowing these guys, or basically turning a blind eye, because I don't think the government necessarily gave them the drugs or whatnot, but in a sense they sanctioned it because they turned a blind eye. They knew that these guys were selling drugs, but they did absolutely nothing about it. I also believe that had they not let these guys sell drugs, it's possible that I would have never become a drug dealer.
What does that say about our government when they're looking the other way while a deadly substance is coming into our communities for the sake of fighting a communist regime in Central America?
Well, it says that our government will sacrifice its people to accomplish a goal. And this is not the first time that they've done that. We've known numerous times in our history where they have sacrificed, especially the black man.
Yes.
Thank you. This gentleman right here in the blue shirt.
Director Deutsch, I have a very simple way that you can prove to us that you intend to get to the bottom of these allegations. And that is the CIA in '81 was overrided under the Reagan administration. When President Ronald Reagan signed Executive Order 12333, he set up a parallel government headed by George Bush, for which Ali North also worked, and they privatized U.S. intelligence. For example, the gentleman that he brought up, Weakley, not Alexander, but Weakley, Scott Weakley, who was said by the government to not be involved with the government, it turns out he was involved in a private operation as part of what's called the Bush asteroids. But you have a private network run by George Bush and Ali North, not the CIA. You won't find the records in the CIA. They're not there. They're in these privatized intelligence agencies. Will you pursue that? Will you pursue Ali North and George Bush and the massive documentation? All these gentlemen, like this gentleman here, the co-defendant of Ricky Ross. Ricky Ross is doing George Bush's time.
Night Special.
For many, it was an allegation all too easy to believe. What began quietly as a newspaper series caught fire on the internet.
This is an American story. This is
Fueled by suspicion, it raged on talk radio.
There's just so much that ties into this.
We have been outraged.
The fury sparked hearings.
But it comes a time now that we sit down and really get down to the nitty-gritty of this issue.
In an historic event, the director of the CIA today came to South Central Los Angeles.
It is an appalling charge that goes to the heart of this country. It is a charge that cannot go unanswered.
But
how are we supposed to trust the CIA official to investigate themselves?
Tonight, crack and the CIA, conspiracy or myth.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
There is within the African American community a high level of distrust of the federal government, and not without reason. In the 1930s, the U.S. Public Health Service recruited 400 poor and illiterate black men in Tuskegee, Alabama. The men, all of whom had syphilis, were told that they would receive treatment. They did not. Instead, they were simply monitored for the next 40 years as the effects of the syphilis destroyed their minds and bodies. In the 1960s, the FBI wiretapped the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., infiltrated the Black Panthers, wiretapped Malcolm X. When the issues were raised, they were routinely denied. There are many other examples of abuses by local, state, and federal authorities, the point being that when a few months ago a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News suggested in a series of articles that the CIA might have played a role in permitting Nicaraguan drug dealers to distribute crack cocaine in south central Los Angeles during the 1980s, that story had enormous resonance within the African American community.
This is not just a smoking gun, it is a smoking cannon that leads all the way to the White House.
If they had put that crack in Beverly Hills, it would be a presidential issue. We love our children just like you love yours.
I think it is enough information here to say to the CIA, you stand accused.
Reaction to the story split largely along racial lines. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times ran extensive reports essentially debunking the accusation. If anything, that only fueled the controversy, convincing many African Americans that there is a conspiracy to cover up the charges. Juanita Millender McDonald, who won a special election to Congress last spring representing Compton and Watts, invited John Deutsch, the director of the CIA, to take part in a town hall meeting in south central Los Angeles. Nothing like it had ever happened before. But to everyone's surprise, Director Deutsch accepted. That meeting took place late today. Our cameras were there, and Judy Mullo reports on what happened.
For this unprecedented talk by a CIA director, unprecedented security. At Locke High School in Watts, heavily armed police officers surrounded the school. Helicopters hovered overhead, and SWAT team members kept watch on the roof. As the arriving audience passed through magnetometers, John Deutsch arrived in a heavily guarded motorcade. He was introduced by a local congresswoman with a challenge.
It is not up to us to prove the CIA was involved in drug trafficking in South Central Los Angeles, whether, or rather, it is up to them to prove that they were not.
The hostility from the audience was apparent from the moment Deutsch rose to speak.
Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Deutsch. Please, if you don't want to give the respect, then you might want to exit at this time.
After order was restored, Deutsch began by expressing empathy with the community's anger.
I understand that people are suspicious of the CIA. In the course of recruiting agents to penetrate drug cartels, to break up those groups that bring drugs to the United States, our case officers, our men and women, deal with bad people, very bad people, sometimes at great risk to their lives. Now, it is alleged that the CIA also helped the Contras raise money for arms by introducing crack cocaine into California. It is an appalling charge. It is an appalling charge that goes to the heart of this country. It is a charge that cannot go unanswered.
He promised a full investigation by the CIA's Inspector General.
As of today, we have no evidence of a conspiracy by the CIA to engage in encouraging drug traffickers in Nicaragua or elsewhere in Latin America during this or any other period. However, I am going to wait and see what the results are of this Inspector General's investigation. If any wrongdoing is discovered, we will pursue it, and those responsible will be brought to justice.
Let's kick off the second half of our show today with a little Central Intelligence drug running. Sean Stone recently sat down with former stockbroker turned ecstasy dealer turned prison reform activist Sean Atwood to discuss his new book, Pablo Escobar, Beyond Narcos, which looks to knock down many of the false narratives surrounding the notorious drug kingpin. Sean started off by asking Atwood about the more recent allegations made by Escobar's own son that his infamous father was indeed colluding with the Central Intelligence Agency.
My research has led me to believe that the biggest drug lord of the 80s and the most successful was actually George H.W. Bush. And that may sound incredulous, but if you look at it from the perspective of the CIA back then, in the early 80s, their priority was fighting communism. And the Medellin cartel, they had to pay to play. So they contributed millions towards the war in Nicaragua that the US government was involved in. And they were allowed to traffic cocaine. Later on, Pablo got used as a pawn in the war on drugs when it was more profitable for Bush because he was aspiring to get the presidency. So they basically sacrificed him at that point.
Right. So as far as the actual drug lords, I mean, obviously there's a certain sort of panache and there's a mystique, obviously, to Escobar. But you make the point in your book that after Escobar was killed, even though he's supposedly one of the big drug lords of the world, it doesn't stop the flow of cocaine into America. So what does that actually mean about the war against him and his cartel? What did it actually serve? What did that actually accomplish?
The war against Pablo Escobar got George Bush looking tough on crime, tough on drugs. He loved to pose with seizures of cocaine. But after Pablo died, the cocaine going into America increased. And that's because Pablo was used. I mean, there was all different countries and routes where the cocaine was coming into America from. Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, Bolivia. If you go back to 1980, the CIA, in cooperation with the Argentine intelligence services, they actually put cocaine traffickers in charge of the government. In Bolivia, it was called the cocaine coup.
Third world, starting back from his days in West Texas with the Zapata Oil Company. He was involved with the CIA, which they helped run logistics to the Bay of Pigs. As head of the CIA, he presided over the head of the CIA in 1976 during the height of Operation Condor, which kind of organized national death squads in Latin America and coordinated their activity. The single largest run of bombings and executions carried out by Condor happened while Bush was the head of the CIA. Iran-Contra as vice president, and so Panama.
And when you say Iran-Contra, just if you could expand on that, especially for young people who don't understand what this was.
Iran-Contra was a many hydra-headed scandal that involved selling high-tech weaponry to Iran, diverting the profits to support the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua and Central America.
In violation of U.S. law.
In violation of U.S. law, but also my gesture to it meant that it supported the worst kind of death squatters and assassins and fascists in Central America throughout the 1980s, and Bush was deeply involved in that as vice president and coming out of his work with the CIA. So my point to the Cleveland of Panama is that Bush had a long history of violence in the Third World as a way of establishing himself, which obviously continued with the first Gulf War.
And a key part of that Iran-Contra is that once Bush becomes president, he pardons all the people who were involved with it.
No, not once he becomes president. When he's leaving.
When he's leaving as president.
By Clinton. In Christmas Eve, 1992, he pardoned 6 of them. And Lawrence Walsh, the independent prosecutor, says that this completes the cover-up of Iran-Contra. So in some ways, it's a precedent for current politics in terms of the limits and limitlessness of presidential power to sweep scandals that they're involved in under the rug.
Now, President Bush defended his decision to issue the pardons. He issued a statement saying in part, first, the common denominator of their motivation, whether their actions were right or wrong, was patriotism. Second, they did not profit or seek to profit from their conduct. Third, each has a record of long and distinguished service to this country. This is Caspar Weinberger, former Secretary of Defense for the Reagan administration, speaking shortly after he was pardoned by George H.W. Bush.
I'm completely confident that I would have been acquitted in a real trial when I and my real attorneys, Bob Bennett and Carl Rao, who are, I think, the finest in the country, would be participants, and they would present real evidence to a real jury. I am very pleased, however, and very relieved that my family and I have been spared this terrible ordeal of a very long and unjustified trial.